Welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are teaching and preserving them. Tonight's show is very unusual because you won't hear a whole lot of Indian language or a lot of analysis of Indian language. The people whose language we're addressing tonight are known to many people as Seminole freedmen, though some in this group prefer the term Black Seminole, or in the Muskogee language, Isti-Lusti, which is written like this on my cap. Isti-Lusti, which literally means black skin. And this is a term that is owned by people in the group, so to speak. I was originally became interested in this group because it occurred to me that I knew there were a freedmen population in various tribes in the state. And I thought probably, or possibly, some of them spoke native languages. Of course, the majority of people in every tribe no longer speak the language, but I thought it would be interesting if the people of African heritage in the different tribes spoke the language, but perhaps in a little bit different way from the people who didn't have the African heritage. Just as in the larger society, there is some correlation between being of African ancestry and speaking a little bit different variety of English. So I was curious about this, and in the course of my research, I met a very interesting and wonderful woman named Lena Shaw. She's one of 4 black members on the Tribal Council of the Seminole Nation. And she gave me a lot of background on who the Seminole freedmen, or Black Seminoles, are, some of their history. And at the time I was speaking to her, there was a conference coming up, and most of the tape you'll see tonight was taped at that conference. This was a conference that basically addressed the English language of the Black Seminoles and found connections between the variety of English that has been spoken by Seminole people in Oklahoma and elsewhere, and people of African heritage in the southeastern part of the United States and in the Sea Islands, where the language there is called Gullah. So the conference was called Black Seminoles and the Gullah Connection. I'm still trying to find a complete answer to my question about whether the Muskogee language or Seminole language might be spoken differently by Black Seminoles than by other Seminoles. And I'm still trying to schedule a show where we can see some of that Muskogee language. In the meantime, I thought I'd show you this tape because it's very interesting and it'll give you a good deal of background on who the Isti-Lusti are. Let's take a look. First of all, let me just introduce what we're going to see first. We're going to see Lena Shaw, who's giving a little presentation or introduction at this Black Seminoles and the Gullah Connection Conference.
I was born in Turkey Creek, Indian Territory. On the tour yesterday, I was bypassed. Chief Haney's hometown, my hometown, was bypassed. Chief Haney lives east of Highway 99, and I was born west of Highway 99. As you're going to Seminole, that's about 7 miles from Seminole proper. At a very early age, I grew up in Shawnee, Oklahoma, not very far from Turkey Creek. We Seminole people, as you all note, we do not wander very far. Someone made a statement, I believe it was Mr. O'Paul, stated that the women, before they could say very much to you, they had to really, really trust you. They had to really, really trust you. So that's just the way that my culture was. We just did not take to people right off of the bat. I received my elementary and secondary education in Shawnee, Oklahoma. Just as on the bus tour we saw that Douglas High School, old Douglas High School, had been turned into a housing addition, same way in Shawnee, Oklahoma. Our high school, which was also included our elementary high school, one building, the elementary kids were taught on the first floor, the high school students were taught on the upper floor. Believe it or not, I graduated from a class of 12 students, and that building is no longer standing today. As you've already heard, I did graduate from Langston University, and those were some of the better days of my life. I enjoyed going to school at Langston University, and at Langston University, we were taught a lot about our heritage. Of course, today, I do not believe that our children have been taught, or are they being taught in the homes about their heritage. We Caesar Bruner band, because our band is striving to include the history of our people. I believe that they have learned more about our people in the band than they will ever hear in the circle of education, and that is definitely a shame. I've heard the words echoed here today that we were hidden. The word hidden may not have been said, but in my mind, for many, many months now, I have said that America, for some reason that I don't know of, are trying to hide our people. We are a unique people, the Gullah Black Seminoles. One of the reasons that I feel that we are unique is because we can trace our heritage back to Africa. During the late 1600s, that you've already heard, the Gullah people escaped into Florida, where they joined the Seminole Indians. From this group of people, we came into being. That's how I see what the Gullah people are. For 60 years, it has always bothered me that our people, the Seminole people, stayed together as one group for 60 long years, from 1838 to 1898, we were all together in Sasaka, Oklahoma, which is the capital of Seminole. Those that went on the tour yesterday saw Sasaka. You saw what a beautiful part of the country Sasaka, Oklahoma is. But we lived together, we wandered together for 60 long years. Then in 1883, one of the nice senators in Washington, D.C. decided that this Oklahoma land should be opened up to the settlers. That was all right for them to open up the land to the settlers, but I feel in my heart that it was a tragedy to separate our people. So they decided for people to go out in the field, better known as the BIA, and to do a roll, to take a roll. In this roll, they put the whites with Indian blood in them on one roll. But if you had a drop of black blood in you, then you would put on another roll. And that, to me, was a tragedy. And also, I thought about how they were lessening the strength of our tribe. Because when we were together as one, we were very, very strong.
Next, I'd like to show you a little bit of a bus tour that conference attendees took in the Black Seminole area, which is around the Seminole and Wewoka, in that general area. This tour was the day before the talks that you're going to see next. Unfortunately, as luck would have it, my camera battery gave out very early in this tour. You'll just see a few moments of some of the attendees trying to retrace their roots and find the graves of important ancestors.
That must be two people's grave. Right. Yeah, must be. Where is that? Yeah. Who's here, you know? 1862 to 1913. And on this side, 1840 to the south. Flower is hiding.
Still alive. Oh, yeah. It's the last 7 years.
Yeah.
There's a little pond over there. Yeah. Nice peaceful spot.
We come down here. It was from Columbus and it was a Columbus Bruno right along in here and right off the left. Columbus Bruno.
Could you point to where, I'm sorry, could you point to where Abraham's grave was? I'm sorry, what name?
It had a fence around it. It had a fence around it. It was the only one that had a separate fence around it.
What kind of headstone was it? Wooden or cement?
No, it was white marble.
Okay.
It was white marble and trimmed in black and gold. It was about that high and 6 foot long, you know, the usual thing. But it was
Could you show
beautiful.
me how high it was?
Now, the rest of what we're going to hear, the rest of this tape, is talks that were given at this conference, which was held at the Capitol building in the Senate chambers in Oklahoma City. And you're going to hear talks by Lena Shaw, Senator Angela Monson, briefly welcoming the crowd, anthropologist Joseph Opala, and several other historians and scholars.
For me, this is a joy as well as an honor and a pleasure just to sit here at this present moment to say words of appreciation for your coming to this special event. Now that you are here, we hope that you will enjoy the full day. I know that you can enjoy that you already heard because of your applause. We hope that you will enjoy being in our state and our city. We hope that you will want to come back to visit us and share with us the many, many blessings of joy and celebration. Thank you so very much for your coming and taking part in this festivity. Mother, sincerely from the heart, Lena Shaw.
I had a chance to read a little about the Gullah connection, and I have had an opportunity over the last couple of years to work with the Seminole freedmen in your endeavors, and you know, I've just been fascinated. I hated history when I grew up. You know, teachers made it so boring. But when you have an opportunity for many of you to really live the history, and for those of us who are now learning the history to understand the value and how tangible the history is, it really means something different to us. So today is our opportunity to share each other's experiences, to explore each other's desires and hopes, to become unified in our desires and hopes, to become one people. You know, we respect the differences. I always tell people diversity is so important. Cultural differences are so important because it's that which makes us better. It's that which makes us stronger. But when we appreciate and recognize the diversity, we also have an opportunity to realize how same we are, how similar we are.
I have to say that this moment for me is literally a dream come true. To be here in the Senate chamber in Oklahoma City. I was born in the city and grew up in this city. But after a while, in ways that I was playing, I also became very closely attached to a little country in West Africa called Sierra Leone. And it was first amazing to me, and then later very gratifying that over the years I've been able to work together with people like Wayne Thompson and many others to forge a link between my native state and the Gullah people in South Carolina and Georgia, and ultimately to Sierra Leone. So in many ways, I have two countries. I lived in Sierra Leone almost 25 years. I consider Sierra Leone almost as much a part of me as Oklahoma in the United States. But it has been very gratifying to be able to bring people together from these far distant points. What I'm going to be talking about today is what that history is all about. The Gullah connection, in a nutshell, is a historical and family, language, and cultural link that goes from Sierra Leone and other countries on the West African coast, which were originally called the Rice Coast, rice-growing Africa. 6 countries in West Africa in particular, and Sierra Leone stands out among them for various reasons. A link between that area, the Rice Coast of West Africa. First, to the Gullah people in coastal South Carolina and Georgia. We have Gullah representatives here today. and then onward, historically, with Gullah-speaking people from South Carolina and Georgia who escaped, as you all know, into the Florida wilderness very early in American history, and who fought more than 3 decades, fought off repeated attempts by the United States military forces to re-enslave them and capture them for 3 decades, until finally, in the late 1830s and 1840s, unable to defeat the Black Seminoles, the U.S. military had to make a road open to them going west Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma. 20 years before the emancipation of Africans elsewhere in America, your ancestors, the Black Seminoles, fought the United States military to a standstill. And as you know, from Oklahoma or Indian Territory, there were further migrations. Some of the Black Seminoles in Florida already had gone to Cuba and the Bahamas. From here, others went on, crossed the Rio Grande into Gullah State in Mexico, and then, as you know, after emancipation in 1870, back across the border into Texas, where they formed the famous Seminole Negro Indian Scouts and won many plaudits and awards for their heroism and bravery. In a nutshell, that's what the Gullah connection is. This link from the West African rice coast, particularly Sierra Leone, this coastal South Carolina and Georgia, the Gullah people, onward to Florida, and from Florida to the Bahamas, Cuba, Oklahoma, Mexico, and Texas. Now, these are the same folks all the way along the line. And even today, there are many cultural and language similarities all the way from Sierra Leone and other parts of the rice coast through the Gullah region and to you here sitting in this room. One thing that you all have in common is rice. And I'll be talking more about that, but rice forms a very important part of the diet all along the Gullah connection, and a language. In Sierra Leone, we call that language Creole. In South Carolina and Georgia, they call it Gullah. And I was understood when I did my research with you all here 20 years ago that the language here was often called flat talk or tuck. And in Texas, they just call it Seminole. But the language is very little changed. Now, I don't know how many of you know still the flat talk, but I'll tell you this, just to give you an example of the similarities. In Sierra Leone, if I ask a group like this, how y'all doing? I say, "Auna de du." "Auna de du." In the Gullah area, the typical way is to say, "How una de du?" "How una de du?" And my understanding is that the old-fashioned flat talk in Seminole County is "How huna de du." Well, you see how similar the language remains through those many thousands of miles and through those hundreds of years of history. But I always thought, the whole time I was in Sierra Leone, that I would one day come back to the United States and study anthropology. And so I was looking for a research project I could do over in Sierra Leone, and it was the U.S. ambassador, a man named Michael Samuels, who pointed to a little island off the coast. He said, "Joe, while you're here in the Peace Corps, study that island." He said, "I'll help you even get a grant," which he did. I got a grant from National Endowment for the Humanities. The little island is called Bunce Island. It's a small little island, not as big as the Capitol grounds here in Oklahoma City. But it was the site of a British slave fortress. Bunce Island operated for 150 years. African people who had been captured were brought there and put in jail, and then ultimately chained together, put on ships for the American side. Now, I had no idea that my research on Bunce Island would lead me to the United States, much less to Oklahoma. Because the vast majority of the slaves shipped from Africa did not go to the United States. 95% of the Africans went to the West Indies and Brazil. Only 5% to North America. But when I later got into the records of Bunce Island, I found that that island was shipping people consistently to Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia, and to some extent, St. Augustine, Florida. The reason had to do with rice. The white planters in coastal South Carolina and Georgia had gotten rich off of rice. And one thing they realized, they didn't know how to grow rice. Rice is very technical. They needed the expertise of African people who had been cultivating rice for centuries. So for 100 years, there was a connection between a small part of West Africa, 6 little countries, and this small part of North America, coastal South Carolina and Georgia. People with rice growing skills and background were funneled from Senegal, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. Were funneled for 100 years into these two small ports, Charleston and Savannah. And so a link between a small part of Africa and a small part of what is now the United States. The story from that point onward is also important for you folks to know. And I know at that point you're very familiar with the history. A very high proportion of the African people who escaped from slavery into the Florida wilderness were Gullah-speaking folks from coastal South Carolina and Georgia. Ancestors of the Black Seminoles, wherever you are, scattered today, were in very large measure Gullah-speaking people off those rice plantations. And when they got into Florida, into what was almost a fully tropical situation, let me tell you, they knew what to do. They had brought all of their skills at tropical agriculture, and especially rice. There's much to learn about South Carolina and Georgia, but the Gullah people are known for having preserved more of their African language and culture than any other Black Americans in the country. And so when the Gullahs got into Florida, their whole African community structure, leadership structure, knowledge of tropical agriculture, and African traditions were virtually intact. And here they were in a Florida wilderness that was much more suitable for them than for white folks at that period. They had come from tropical West Africa. They had resistance against malaria and yellow fever. And as I say, they had all these agricultural skills. And if you look at the early accounts of Black Seminole settlements in Florida, every village is surrounded by rice fields. The rice comes from West Africa into South Carolina, Georgia, now it's in Florida. Rice was an important part of the Black Seminoles' adaptation to Florida. What they used to do, in fact, was they'd have the rice fields around their village, and then they'd have a rice field 20, 30 miles off in the bush, so that if the soldiers came and burned their village, they'd have a fallback position. And using tactics like that, as you know, they confused U.S. military forces for a long time. I won't go into the details because you folks know, you know about the Negro Fort episode. You know about the First Seminole War. And of course you know about the Second Seminole War. But what I do want to do, just to give an important impression, is to quote a few important people from that period who were following the First and Second Seminole Wars. The commander-in-chief of American forces in the Second Seminole War, Thomas Sidney Jessup, wrote the War Department and said, "Gentlemen, be assured this is a Negro and not an Indian war." He was speaking to the fact that the Black Seminoles were in the forefront of Seminole resistance. A representative in the U.S. House of Representatives from New Hampshire said this on the floor of the House of Representatives. Listen to this quote. "It appears from the facts in this case that a portion of these Negroes have been in contention against the whole military power of the United States and all the appliances that our government can bring to bear." This is 20 years before emancipation. What we have is an African population working side by side with their Seminole Indian brothers and sisters. But we have a very powerful and a very determined and a very skillful Black population fighting off every attempt by the U.S. military to re-enslave. You know what happened. The military ultimately had to cut a deal. And your ancestors were escorted from Tampa Bay west to New Orleans, up the Mississippi, up the Arkansas, and ultimately into what is now Oklahoma. 20 years before emancipation, the U.S. Army had to admit that it had been fought to a standstill by African warriors. And ever since this idea of a Gullah connection, ever since it finally sort of started to come together in my mind, I have felt extremely proud that the Black Seminoles and Gullahs are my fellow Americans. President Mombo invited Mr. Campbell to lead a homecoming group to Sierra Leone the following year, 1989, which happened in November of that year. We were fortunate that 3 members of the Black Seminoles here in Oklahoma were able to come, particularly Lance and Lawrence Cudjoe, the late Lance and Lawrence Cudjoe, who, as you know, were band leaders at that time. In the local magazine, news magazine in Sierra Leone, it said a double homecoming, because it was clear that while the Gullahs and the Sierra Leoneans were coming the Gullahs and the Black Seminoles were as well. It was a great privilege for me to watch them and the other Gullahs exchanging all this language and rice recipes and cultural information, even as they were in the rice coast of West Africa, learning about their ultimate root. Called Family Across the Sea. And it's on this whole Gullah Connection history that I've outlined for you, right up to the Black Seminoles, and then it covers the return trip to Africa, so that you can also see Lance and Lawrence Cudjoe in this documentary as well. But this is a key document for us as we begin to discuss how to commemorate the Sierra Leone Rice Coast Gullah Black Seminole connection.
How I wanted to do. That's our Gullah greeting for how are you doing. We're glad to see you and we're glad to be here with you. We're glad to see you and we're glad to be here with you. I bring you greetings from Penn Center. That's a center where we work in the midst of the Sea Islands. And that center got started in 1862 right in the midst of the Civil War to try to get us adjusted to mainstream American culture. Because at that time we were told we had no culture. I guess you've heard that before.
Now, one of the, I'm thinking about all the remarks made by my fellow panelists, and each of them sort of gathered another thought for me, particularly what Ryan was saying in a talk that an author in California, Cherie Moraga, said, and one of her African-American friends said, Cherie is Mexican-American, she's Native American, and she's white as well. And this black friend said, you know, you're a first American, but we're the forced Americans. And I find this to be very poignant at this time, that some of us who were brought to this country were brought against our will. But brought here, we found the courage to survive, we found the tools necessary to live, and we also found a way to preserve that memory, that identity. And what Dr. Holloway meant too, said earlier was about empowerment. Well, identity is empowerment.
We, as a people, should recognize that the things that bring us together should be stronger than things that put us apart. And from Sierra Leone, I want to let you know that the warrior spirit that your ancestors came with is not lost in the continent, in the modern continent.
That last gentleman was Abdul Kondari, a Sierra Leonean living in the United States. See you next time on Wordpath.
Yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene madaoni kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene madaoni kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene madaoni kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene.